Hey guys, Kenna here. Today we're going to be looking at the fossil record and how the fossil record provides evidence to help support the idea of evolution. We're also going to look at how fossils are formed, how many species these fossil records suggest ever existed on our planet, and how many of them are now extinct. And we'll talk about the difference between relative and radioactive dating. So let's go ahead and take a look at our essential questions. Number one, what are fossils and how are they formed? Let's talk a little bit about exactly what a fossil is, what makes a fossil, and how we get those fossils. Number two, what percentage of all species that ever lived on the planet are now extinct? Based on the evidence that we have from these fossils, how many species are there ever on the planet, and how many of them are gone now? And number three, how are relative and radioactive dating used in bracketing? So there are two main types of dating that we use when we start looking at putting ages on fossils, and those are relative dating, which is going to be a comparison, and radioactive dating, which uses radioactive isotopes to come up with a fairly specific date from when that particular fossil was formed. Okay, now what we've been looking at is we've really been studying life's history, and that really is the focus of biology and in evolution in particular, where species change over time. That's been a big piece of what we've been talking about. This can be one of the most fascinating and challenging parts of what we're covering. One technique to go ahead and get a history of life on our planet, since we haven't been here for most of it, is to look at the story that's been written in the ancient rocks and the petrified sap of ancient trees and peat bogs, tar pits, polar glaciers, etc. What we're looking at are the remains of ancient life, and these are what we call fossils. Now, the fossil record provides evidence about how the history of life has unfolded here on our planet. It also shows how different groups of organisms have changed over time when we start looking at similarities between these fossils and where they're found. Fossils occur in a very particular order. Certain fossils also occur in very particular types of rocks. And over the billions of years of history of our planet, ancient unicellular organisms have slowly given rise to the current life that you see around you on our planet. The big thing I want you to take away from this is that more than 99% of all species that have ever lived on our planet are now extinct. You are a part of the 1% of all life that has ever existed on our planet that's still alive. So there's far more species that have gone extinct than there are currently in existence. But that should make some sense too, because we're talking about billions of years, not hundreds, not thousands, not even millions, but billions of years of history of our planet. So first, let's go ahead and take a look at how fossils are formed. Most fossils are formed through a process by which we go ahead and have an organism that dies, and it is an area of sedimentation. So some lake, some river, some stream, and when it dies, it becomes saturated, it sinks to the bottom. Over time, sediments or rocky materials are placed on top of that dead decaying organism, and that puts pressure on it. And instead of it all decaying and breaking down, it gets pressurized and compressed into essentially what we would call a fossil. The dead organisms are buried by layers of sediment, and those form new rock. And as that forms new rock, eventually that rock will be weathered away, and some sort of erosion or digging will lead us to those remains, and then we can go ahead and study it. So, what types of pieces of organisms, etc., actually form these fossils? Well, fossils include preserved forms of all sorts of different things, ranging from complete animals like you see here, which is actually pretty rare, to animal fragments, which is far more common. We've found eggs, and in some cases, these eggs have been intact enough that we've actually been able to use MRI and CT scans to actually determine what type of dinosaur produced those eggs. It's pretty spectacular. Dinosaur footprints. We've seen animal droppings. You see something called a coprolite. Okay, these are fossilized animal droppings, and plenty of parts of plants or plants as a whole. Okay, so how do we go ahead and get information about how old this fossil or something similar to this would actually be? Well, there are three techniques that we typically use. Number one is what we call radioactive dating. This is the most reliable version that we have, and what we do is we use half-life decay of radioactive elements to figure out the date fairly precisely. Okay. If we can't do that, sometimes you can't find a material that can be radioactively dated, then we go ahead and use like a sequence of dates, something we call superposition, where the oldest material is on the bottom and the youngest material is on top. And even if you can't find the exact layer, you know that it's older than or younger than. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit. The last piece is molecular clocks. And so molecular clocks are the use of DNA to show how long ago two organisms separated in terms of sharing a gene pool, how far apart they've become in terms of isolation. Remember, we talked about reproductive isolation, and then we kind of extrapolate backwards. Okay, so this is the idea of molecular clocks. And while you can do this with like some DNA that may be extracted from, a petrified mosquito like in Jurassic Park, most old fossils you can't do this for because the DNA has already been destroyed. They have been able to use some of this with things that have been permafrozen, that they've thawed out, things like woolly mammoths and stuff. But for most of our old things, this is not an option. All right, so let's look into a little bit more detail on radioactive dating and relative dating. We'll save molecular clocks and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into classification next week. Okay, so let's look at radioactive dating. As I mentioned, radioactive dating uses half-lives to determine the age of a sample. In radioactive dating, scientists calculate the age of the sample based on the amount of remaining radioactive isotope it contains. Naturally occurring materials with a particular element, whether it's radioactive carbon 14 or something like that, have a certain amount of this unstable isotope. And over time, the unstable isotope breaks down into a different material. And as it does that, you can go ahead and get a percentage and see how much time has passed since that sample was created. People commonly talk about carbon dating. This is probably the most well-known version of radioactive dating, but this is usually only used on fossils that are less than 60,000 years old. The half-life for radioactive carbon 14 is not very long. And because of this, samples that are older than 60,000 years old cannot be reliably uh, dated using carbon 14, if at all. They may not even be able to radioactively date them using that element because there may be little to none left. So with a half-life of about 5,730 years, you need something a lot longer than that to go ahead and get a good date for these things we're talking about that are millions of years. Okay, so typically we'll look at something like potassium 40, uranium 238, but the problem with these, even though they have much longer half-lives, is that not all rock formations seem to have these, especially when we're looking at fossils. And so typically you'll have to use a rock layer to go ahead and get you a very specific age for this particular rock layer that probably doesn't have any fossils with it, but there may be some just above or just below it. So let's talk a little bit about how that fits in with the next idea, which is relative dating. In relative dating, we're doing that superposition we talked about, where we're not necessarily putting specific dates on it because we're not dating it radioactively, but we can say, depending on where it's found in the rock layers, that it's older than or younger than. You may not know my age, and you may walk down the street and you may look at a little kid and you may not know their age. But when you look at me, you can say that I am older than you are. When you look at that little kid that's playing out in the front yard, you can say, ah, they look younger than I am. You can get a pretty good idea of whether they're older than or younger than, even if you don't know their exact age. This is kind of what we're doing when we're doing relative dating. The oldest layers are on the bottom. The more recent layers are closer to the Earth's surface, and this is what we call the law of superposition. Another thing we use to help out with relative dating is something called index fossils. To perform relative dating, we may want to go ahead and find a fossil that we do know the age of, that was only on the planet for a very short period of time, but may be found all over the world. We can then look for that fossil, and if we find it, we have a pretty good idea of what time period exists in that particular rock level. Okay. So relative dating allows paleontologists to estimate the fossil's age compared to that of known fossils that are found in close proximity. And then you use that sort of comparison again of the law of superposition. Is it below it, which makes it older? Is it above it, which makes it younger? Here are a couple examples of some index fossils that are used for different time periods. Okay, and we'll look at the time periods in the next half of this week's activities. So if you look at the Cenozoic era, which is what we are in here at the top, we're actually in the Quaternary. You can see some shell species that are making really good index fossils, but you can see some species going all the way back to the very earliest parts of the Paleozoic, which is an early part, like the Cambrian time period, where you can see some sort of trilobite that is used as a fossil that was found for a very short period of time all around the world. And so it makes it pretty simple to go ahead and identify that this happened during this Cambrian time period. All right, so now you have relative dating using index fossils or known rock layers. You have radioactive dating, which gives you specific time period in years for how old a particular object is or rock layer. But typically we have to use some common combination of the two. This process of using both relative and radioactive dating is what we call bracketing. Okay? If you take a look over here, and we start looking at, say, this fossil right here, okay, we may not be able to radioactively date it. Okay? Obviously, carbon dating isn't going to work because it's way too old. Maybe the material, because it's a sedimentary rock, does not have enough potassium-40, uranium-238 to go ahead and radioactively date. But what we can do is we can look for something like this rock layer, which has maybe a lava flow or something that has high levels of those material, and something similar here, okay? And when we go ahead and take a look at this, we can get actual dates for this rock layer and actual dates for this rock layer. So while we can't get an exact date for this particular rock layer, what we can do is we can go ahead and say, I know that it has to be older than this because it's below it, and it has to be younger than this because it's above it. So the age for this particular sample would be something like older than 495 million years ago, but it's younger than 510 million years ago. Okay, so this is how we can go ahead and start taking a look at how the information is, oops, how the information can be utilized to give an age for a rock layer that is not datable directly. Okay. You may also be able to use an index fossil to go ahead and do a similar type of analysis when we go ahead and take a look at doing this type of bracketing. Okay. Fossils are generally found in sedimentary rock, those layers coming down and being deposited on them in rivers, lakes, and streams. These rocks can be used in carbon dating, but for older things like these millions of years ago that we're looking at here, this doesn't work. And so we need to rely on igneous rocks, those that are formed by volcanoes, that we can actually go ahead and get uranium, potassium, radioactive isotopes to go ahead and test for. So it's a combination of both relative and radioactive dating that allows us to go ahead and move on with a pretty reliable time scale for when events happened in the history of our planet. Okay? So let's compare the two major pieces that we talked about. We have relative dating and absolute dating. Now, when we go ahead and take a look at absolute dating, hopefully you'll recognize that what we're talking about here, is really radioactive dating. Okay? All right. So this is radioactive dating. Now, let's start out by taking a look at what these two things can determine. In relative dating, we can't get an actual year. Okay, what we can get is we can go ahead and get the age of the fossil with respect to other fossils. It's older than, it's younger than. Whereas you can get an actual age of the fossil in years using radioactive dating. Okay, so how do we perform these two types of dating? With relative dating, we're comparing depth. This is that law of superposition we were talking about, where things that are on the bottom are older, things that are on the top are younger. Okay? When we go ahead and perform absolute or radioactive dating, what we need to do is get a sample of the material, send it back to the laboratory, and look for the amount of a certain radioactive isotope versus the non-radioactive isotope. Then we can go ahead and look at how common that percentage is, and we can get a good idea of whether or not it has been around for X number of years. Okay. Now, both of these have their strengths and their weaknesses. Okay. This is why we typically do bracketing, which combines the two, so we can make the best of both of these two particular processes. The biggest drawback to relative dating is that you really don't get any actual numbers in terms of years. You can only say younger than, older than. So unless you have numbers on something, this really can't give you a full timeline for how long things were around, when things specifically happened. But very wonderfully is that we can go ahead and do this very easily in the field. You can walk out, you can see the rock strata, and you can get a good idea of, this is older than, this is younger than, without having to have any special tools. Unlike radioactive dating, where you have to have, the radioactive isotopes, they have to be present. You have to take a sample to a laboratory so that you can go ahead and look at the percentage of the radioactive isotope compared to the other one. This is more expensive and more difficult to perform. Okay. Whereas the relative dating is maybe not as precise because it doesn't give us actual numbers. It's very easy to do and it's very cheap. Biggest benefit of radioactive isotopes and radioactive dating is that it gives us a fairly specific age in years. But again, you have to go through the extra work. You have to make sure the materials are there, and then you have to run the lab tests. Okay. So when we start looking at samples and we start trying to look at these fossils, we find them all over the world. They're definitely hotspots. This one actually is a pretty cool example. It's an intact skeleton, which, as I mentioned before, is not the most common. You typically are much more likely to find fragments. Um, but we can learn a lot from the species that were here before us, and we can start getting an idea in terms of age of these species, when they existed, and with respect to where humans fit into this whole puzzle. But there's a long history of our planet. Remember, we're looking at billions of years, not thousands, not millions, not hundreds. Okay. If you want to go to a place that has a pretty good examples of this in the United States, you can go to the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry in Utah, or you can go down to the La Brea Tar Pits in Southern California. If you want to stay here in Oregon, head over to the John Day Fossil Beds. That would probably be your best example of this in our state. And this is probably going to be much more recent than the dinosaurs. If you go to the John Day Fossil Beds, we're probably looking at proto-rhinos and camels and lots of clams, lots and lots of plant fossils. So if you ever get a chance, Painted Hills unit, Sheep Rock unit of the John Day Fossil Beds, these are great places to go if you're interested in learning more about fossils. I'm sure there are plenty of really cool virtual tours that you can take online, especially now. All right, you guys, that's all for today. I hope you guys are doing well. Take care of yourselves. Stay healthy, stay happy, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.